Canada's news is a mess, writes Marc Edge. Every time I think media ownership in Canada can't get any worse, from concentration to convergence to hedge funds and owners like Conrad Black and Izzy Asper to faceless vultures, it just keeps getting worse, he says. So what is to be done? Is it time for journalism to adopt a new business model? Those are some of the questions he poses in a new book. Here to talk about tomorrow's news, how to fix Canada's media, is Marc Edge. Well, when we talk about journalism and the business of journalism, that is to say, I want to spend a bit of time answering the question, how did we get here? In the book, you say, in Canada, media owners seemingly always get their way, no matter how harebrained their latest scheme might be and its possible consequences for consumers, citizens, or even the country. So, in a nutshell, how did we get here and who is to blame?
Well, the newspaper business has always been subject to high economies of scale, so tends towards consolidation and monopoly. The biggest problem was that during the 2008 2009 recession, our largest newspaper company went bankrupt, not because it wasn't making money, it was, but they'd taken on so much debt during the convergence craze at the millennium. CanWest Global Communications was the third television network, of course. They bought the Southern newspaper chain, and they couldn't, when the recession hit, they couldn't keep up their debt payments, so they were taken over by their bondholders, mostly U.S. hedge funds, who now own 98% of the company and have been buying up other Canadian newspaper chains ever since. Sun Media in 2015, the Brunswick News chain in 2022, and just last year, Saltwire, which dominates Atlantic Canada. So most of our largest newspapers are now owned 98% by American vulture capitalists.
Now, that was you covered a lot of that ground in your last book, The Post-Media Effect. In this book, in tomorrow's news, you look at a number of different business models, the nonprofit alternative, the cooperative approach, as well as government subsidies and the problems with each. Let's start with that nonprofit alternative. You explore the demise of the Valley Journal, which was a small-town newspaper in Carbondale, Colorado, and the Sopris Sun, the nonprofit alternative that rose up in its place. What can we learn from examples like this?
Well, in the US, they have a much more extensive system of nonprofit news media because they're allowed to accept charitable donations under Section 501c3 of their Income Tax Act. We haven't had this in Canada until the past few years, but the requirements are so rigorous that only about a dozen media outlets have gained charitable status. But my research for the past quarter century into the news media has shown that the fact that they once made so much money is probably the biggest problem we have, because they've been taken over by owners such as hedge funds that they expect those types of returns now. They're not interested in growing media for a sustainable future. They're just what's called harvesting with the debt payments that they've been taking out of the company since 2010. I estimated in my last book that they now amount to more than $500 million. That would go a long way to providing quality journalism in Canada, but that's not what they're interested in. They're in the debt collection business. So I think we have to come up with a better system. I think we should grow the nonprofit side of journalism for a change.
Now, one of the barriers to nonprofits is the CRA's restrictions on what is deemed political content. Is it not?
Yes, it is. They put a limit of 10% political content on nonprofits, but that could easily. Uh, the biggest problem, like I say, is getting the charitable donations flowing. So I think they have to simplify the regulations and make it easier for nonprofit media to accept charitable donations. But this would all be part of a larger news media ecosystem, which I envision, perhaps only after the current system crashes and burns, which it's pretty well done already. There are other models as well, like you mentioned, the co-op model. And there are some problems with a nonprofit news media in that they're still subject to influence by their funders. And in the US, most of the funders are large foundations, which are places that rich people put their tax dollars rather than giving them to the government so they can decide how to spend them themselves. And it hasn't been a very healthy development. I think we need to completely re-envision news media in Canada, and I have a media ecosystem that's stocked with different sorts of species, including nonprofits and cooperatives, even for-profit media, if they can still make a profit, like some, such as the Globe and Mail, Winnipeg Free Press, are making a sustainable transition to hybrid print online publications, but the hedge funds aren't interested in that. Like I say, they're just harvesting the debt which they bought for pennies on the dollar 15 years ago.
Now, another business model you look at is the co-op or the employee-owned approach. Perhaps the best known example of this in Canada, at least, is My Old Shop, Check TV. 15 years after going independent, they are thriving with plenty of local programming. Uh, in your book, you explored a little bit, but let's talk about it here. How did they do it, and how are they so successful in such a hostile climate?
Well, by going a co-op and saving the TV station, which dates to the 1960s, I believe, that the community rallied around them and bought advertising, and they were able to dig themselves out of a deep hole. And like you say, they're thriving now. So this provides a model for other news media across the country. The Prince Albert a Daily Herald in Saskatchewan went the co-op model, and numerous newspapers in Quebec have. So I think that's a viable option for rescuing endangered publications and broadcasting stations, and that's something that the government could also encourage with regulations. They recently brought in a new type of co-op ownership, which might be a good model for news media.
Are there any drawbacks to the employee-owned model?
Well, there have been in the past, there have been a number of employee owned publications in the US. The biggest problem is that they've been so successful and so profitable that the employee owners have tended to sell out. But I don't know if that would be such a big problem these days.
All right. When we talk about fixing the news, you say there is a role for government to play here, no matter who holds power in Ottawa. You also note, as many have, that there's a very good chance that Canada will swing back to another conservative decade soon. So any solution to the problem would likely have to conform to their ideals. So, having said all that, how do you see a conservative government handle the business of journalism, especially given what Pierre Poilievre has said about the CBC, for example?
Well, this is the problem. It's not just the CBC, which he has promised to defund. He's also promised to cancel the subsidies, which the Liberal government brought in starting in 2019. And if the Conservatives did that, there would basically be a collapse of news media in Canada. Instead of defunding them, I think we need to increase their funding with earmarked digital taxes on the tech, big tech giants, which some of which have already been brought in the Online Streaming Act and the Digital Services Tax. These are generating billions of dollars in revenues, a fraction of which could be diverted to funding news media under a voucher system, which I talk about, giving Canadians several $100s every year to spend on subscriptions to the news media of their choice. And we could soon have a thriving news media in Canada and bring what I'm calling a new golden age of journalism.
Well, let's unpack this a bit. Where would the digital tax come from? Would this be from what you pay for, say, what you pay to your ISP every month, to your wireless company every month? How would that work?
Yes, well, the Online Streaming Act already requires the streaming companies like Netflix and Spotify to contribute, I think it's 5% of their Canadian revenues to various different funds, one of which is a news fund. Then there is the digital streaming tax. And like I say, some of that could be earmarked for a news media fund. Google is already contributing $100 million a year. Facebook said, no, thank you very much. We'll stop running links to news media stories in Canada. But there are also other sources. A lot of people are making a lot of money off internet access in Canada. The big telecoms are making profit margins up to 50%. At last count, they were raking in about $16 billion a year in revenues to hook us up to the internet. And 5% of that, like the streamers are paying and like the cable companies pay on their television revenues, would go a long way to funding news. I envision a fund that could exceed $1 billion a year.
Do you anticipate any sort of resistance to this idea? Because it seems Canadians love journalism, but not too many are willing to pay for it.
Well, the resistance will come from the big telecoms. They're making huge profits and paying out huge dividends. So there will be a lot of resistance from Bell and Rogers, and they own the television networks now. Bell owns CTV, Rogers owns City TV. So they have considerable influence, and then they're not going to part with these profits easily.
And when we talk about this voucher system, would there be some sort of office or agency that would manage that, a government agency perhaps?
Yes, there would have to be what I'm envisioning as a new crown corporation to be in charge of distributing these funds and doing various other worthwhile things, such as saving some of our historic publications from going out of business and enabling workers to form co-ops to rescue their own publications, things like this. And they would administer the voucher system through a web portal in which each tax-paying Canadian could sign into every year, receive their annual allotment, and spend it however they like. And this would democratize the funding of news media rather than having some government bureaucrats or politicians decide who gets the money. Citizens and readers themselves would decide that.
Has this been tried anywhere? Is there a place or a time that we could look to where this existed, where we could see the successes and the failures of a voucher system?
The first place to introduce one has been the District of Columbia. Washington, D.C. recently introduced a motion to devote 1% of its revenues to a voucher system. I don't think it's been voted on yet. In Europe, several countries allow you to devote 1% of the income tax you pay every year to nonprofits, and that has succeeded in helping to bolster nonprofit news media. Of course, in Europe and especially in Scandinavia, they've been subsidizing news media for years without much complaint about political interference or media bias, simply because there are such good procedures in place to insulate journalists from political influence.
Would an idea like that fly here, though? We already have resistance to newspapers getting money and being accused of bias by conservatives, but still, there is the perception there, and it's not a good one.
There's nothing wrong with bias as long as you have a diversity of bias. The problem is when you get a system like we have now, most of the newspapers are, like I say, are owned by U.S. hedge funds, which are moving them even farther to the right politically as a marketing a scheme. Of course, there's complaints that the CBC is liberal, but like I say, that's okay. There should be room in the ecosystem for a diversity of political viewpoints, and people can choose the ones that resonate best with them, and that's where they'll spend their voucher money.
And a final word on digital taxes. You end the book by saying Public funding of news media from earmarked digital taxes is required to save our news media and help us avoid a social and political cataclysm. Consider it not an expense, but an investment. Is this something that Canadians could adopt? Could get
Yes, and this is the argument I make to conservatives who, of course, as you mentioned, may be taking power soon federally. A healthy journalism ecosystem would save millions of dollars, through investigative reporting on government waste and corruption and business corruption. And I think we could save a lot of money by having a good journalism, especially what's known as accountability journalism, rather than the access journalism or public relations that we see now.
fair enough. In closing, who is this book for, and what do you hope they get out of it?
Well, this book is all for all Canadians who deserve better. I think they need to be better informed about the alternatives that are possible for their news media rather than the corporate for profit alternative that we have now. There are other alternatives that could work better in the future. There's not much money left in news media now, as you may know. So I think it's time we started looking at it as a public service rather than a money making venture.
The name of the book is Tomorrow's News: How to Fix Canada's Media. It is published by New Star Books. My thanks to author Marc Edge.
Thank you.